the beauty of Shabbat, the beauty of the Sabbath, has been totally lost in the United States at this point in time. And knowing Rabbi Gadi now and seeing how he celebrates the Sabbath and how important it is to rest, and how that has been totally obliterated in Western culture at this point. Sunday is just another day. So I'm trying to recover at the shrine and at my preaching and teaching a lot of times. Let's remember the Sabbath, and God made us to enjoy His creation. We need to work on our relationships, our family. We need to rest. We need to worship, and for us to work better. But otherwise, if we remove the Sabbath from our thinking and our practice, we really are that little hamster on the wheel. And we're just going around and around and around. And we wonder why today so many people are just at wit's end. They haven't had that rest, and they haven't sought wisdom. They have a lot of knowledge. Boy, oh boy, do we have knowledge. But to find the wisdom of God, now that's a spiritual journey. And that's why, since the beginning of my ministry too, pilgrimage has always been a part of my desire to lead people on a pilgrimage. Because you do have to stop your clock, get off the clock, so that you can find divine time and find God's clock. And so by literally going to a different place and carving out some time, new things can happen, new growth spiritually can happen. And I just find so many people just kind of just stuck in the rat race, as they call it, around and around it goes. And it's such a sadness for me, as I see so many people even lose their families. One gentleman come in and talks about, he's lost his kids. He's working all the time, working. And now he feels like he's lost his family. Please God, he can retrieve it. But so many stories like this I hear at the shrine. So it's an important thing for the business community, for leadership. Give your people a break. They have to have that Sabbath. Now, for some it's going to be Friday, for some it'll be Saturday, some it'll be Sunday. But if you're not celebrating something, you're missing a lot about what life is all about.
Yeah, and I want to talk about that a little bit, and I want to get back to the point you made about the fourth generation. I mean, I think it is very clear that as a country we've sort of lost we've lost our way. At this point, I can tell you from my perspective. So, I'm the third generation, and my daughter is the fourth generation. She's a junior at Fordham University, and you figure a Jesuit college. But they're not leading them down any sort of path there as well. I mean, higher education has gotten to be where there's so much pressure to get tuition dollars that it's sort of lost their focus. How did you make that choice to go from business to a man of faith? And what realistically, particularly for the business community that watches this show, what realistically do we need to get back to be able to get that tradition back in our lives? Because it's gone.
Absolutely. I say twice in my life, I said, thank God that I keep the Sabbath. One, when I worked in the corporate world, I worked for a bank, Société Générale, and I remember people working around the clock. And even when they were taking vacations, they would call in. We had to take a vacation for 2 weeks straight because they had to look through our computers. And the people who took 2 weeks off still called into the office every day. And I remember promising myself I would never be in the situation that I would work somewhere where I cannot go away, because that means slavery. The difference between Egypt and Rehoboth means that is the Sabbath, because if you don't stop, that means you're a slave. If you can't put your phone away for a few hours, you're a slave to your phone. So instead of using the phone is using you. That is the difference. And that's why we call it the source of blessing. The Sabbath is the source of blessing, that you can tell the world, I'm now in charge. 6 days I work, but I'm now am in charge and decide to stop. A slave cannot decide to stop, but I'm in charge. So and take that time off to really contemplate, to think that the creation, God's creation, was not complete until God rested, until he looked back at creation and said it was good. If we can't take that break and take a step back and contemplate, then we're just slaves going around the hamster wheel. The next step, when you step back and contemplate and study, take that time to learn, then you understand and you can incorporate other people and other ideas into your life. Otherwise, if you're in this race, it's always, I have to be on top, I have to achieve more, and we're always going to stay one above the other or one instead of the other. That is the key, is to take a break. But for that, you have to have, it's a leap of faith. The other time I thank God for keeping the Sabbath is when I was with my sister and her family and the kids in Disney World. And they kept going. And I thought at a certain point, after 7 days going through all the parks, I've had enough. And thank God I keep the Sabbath. And then I said, all right, I can't go. God, ordains that I stay here. So, but this is what it is. It's to stay, is to keep yourself, to withhold back. The first commandment of God to Adam and Eve was not to do something. It was to stay away from something, right? Stay away from the tree of knowledge. Stay back. And we say that God actually, according to Kabbalah, created the world this way. Because if God is omnipresent, omnipotent, it means that there's no other anything but God. So how did God even create anything? Something outside of him. So the idea is that he contracted himself to allow room for somebody else or something else to exist, right? So when we keep the Sabbath and we hold ourselves back, which is the hardest thing to do, to hold ourselves back, and all the commandments, really, at the bottom of all the commandments, the idea is that to teach ourselves to, what I call, to curb our enthusiasm, right? So we can't allow our neighbor to exist. To really love our neighbor, we have to allow them to exist. So the Sabbath, to take a break, is where we really connect with God. And on that idea of contracting ourselves, and this is why we call it the source of blessing.
That's really interesting.
Another thing I could add to this, Gadi has introduced me to the beautiful Hebrew language, and every word, every letter means something. So English has its own roots, of course, but I love to preach about the idea of recreation, but the word is really recreation. And so sometimes we forget and we get lost in recreation on the Sabbath, but it really is meant to be recreative. And then we are doing the work of God in our family, in our relationships, in the world. So we need to do that recreation. I love to hear that too, this idea that God wants us to cooperate with him and to learn from him so that we could create the space, the holy space in this world where new life, of course, always comes forth.